Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event. I hope I'm not too loud and I move my microphone a bit away from my face. Is that better? Is that okay? Is that the right? Yes, great. I'd like to welcome you all online and here to this event. It's organized through the Human Evolution and Archaeological Sciences Forschungsverbund here at the University of Vienna. My name is Tom Higham, and I'm a professor of scientific archaeology here in the university. And I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Rebecca Wragg-Sykes, who's a research associate at the University of Liverpool here today. Becky is here for a couple of days as part of an extensive, some might say, world tour, promoting her fantastic book, Kindred. And fortunately for me, I'm much less successful, but nonetheless an author that has written a book recently too. So we thought it would be fun to get together and have a sort of conversation and talk about some of the things that we've been writing about in these books, as well as more general themes regarding the exciting field of human evolution and paleoanthropology and how we know what we know about the past. And as many of you know, it's a really extraordinarily exciting time to be working in this field because of new archaeology, new excavations, and a lot of cutting edge science that is being brought to bear upon this subject. So I just want to say welcome to everyone, and I hope you enjoy our little chit chat here over the next 45 minutes or so. Let's see how we go. But first, we thought it would be nice to just introduce what these books are about and what in fact we've written. So Becky, would you like to go first?
Yes, hello. And thank you for introducing me, Tom. As Tom said, I'm an archaeologist, so Tom's more like a archaeological science maestro. I'm somebody who trained in stone tool analysis, had a postdoc at the University of Bordeaux at the Passéa laboratory. And after that, I sort of shifted sideways into writing popular science archaeology. So so the book, this is the English edition. There is a German one as well that's just out. And so one thing that's kind of interesting actually is the differences in the titles, because the title of the English one, Kindred, kindred is such a great word, but not all languages have the same word. And in English, if you're not sure exactly, kindred has several meanings. It means to be physically related to somebody by blood. It can mean to have a feeling of affinity with somebody. And it sort of has a broader meaning of like a whole family or a whole sort of group of people with either a shared interest or shared relations. So it's actually a perfect word for a book, in my opinion, to write about Neanderthals. And the subtitle, which is the same in German, Life, Love, Death, and Art, it tells you what I was hoping to do with this book, which is to write something which is a definitive account, really, of what we know about Neanderthals, and particularly drawing on the archaeological record. So I talk about genetics. Obviously, you can't talk about Neanderthals now without talking about ancient DNA. But I really wanted to, showcase the absolutely mind-boggling things that archaeology as a discipline can do when you're dealing with a record that is tens or hundreds of millennia old, and where we lack, the richness or the diversity of different sorts of objects that we have in later prehistory. For Neanderthals, the range of things we have is much smaller, but we can do incredible things with it. It forces you to be very creative, I think. So I wanted to share all of this information that we know as specialists, although Neanderthals are always in the news, in the headlines, there's always new discoveries. those are sort of just small windows into this broader context of archaeology and what we know about their lives, their world, the behavior, that I guess is something that I was hoping that would be useful to people. So that's kind of what I was aiming to do with this book. So over to you.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, so mine is called The World Before Us, How Science is Revealing a New Story of Our Human Origins. And I never thought I was going to be able to write a book. I thought I didn't have enough time, and I was more interested in writing papers, short scientific papers about results that we were generating through the lab. So to cut a long story short, as Becky says, my background is in radiocarbon dating and archaeology. And I did my undergraduate and doctoral research in New Zealand. And New Zealand has a very short prehistoric chronology. It's only about 750 years. When I came to the UK in 2001, I almost immediately met a colleague who became a very good friend and colleague, Dr. Roger Jacoby, who was a Paleolithic specialist. And he wanted to work on dating the British Paleolithic record. And at that time, we had some new methods that we were using that were very good at removing contamination. So we forged a good collaboration, and we worked together for the next 8 years until, unfortunately, Roger had a very untimely death of cancer. So I lost my good friend and colleague, but I continued to work with other people. And as I say, I wasn't really intending to write a book, but then I got involved in the work at Denisova Cave, which is this incredible site in Siberia, where in 2010, paleogeneticists working at the Max Planck Institute, using ancient genomics, discovered the DNA of a never before found hominin, which they've subsequently called the Denisovans. And I became involved in research there through my Russian work. I've been working in Russia since about 2003. And so we began working at Denisova Cave, and the work that I was involved with there was just so mind-bogglingly amazing. I just wanted to share it with people. And there hadn't been any books written about Denisovans or anything at that stage. So, and I was in New Zealand doing some lectures. I was sponsored by a scientific organization there. And I traveled to 9 main centers and I gave talks. And after every talk, I'd get some really nice questions and comments about what I talked about. And several of them were like, could you recommend a book about what you've been discussing? And I kind of couldn't. I mean, there were books by people like Chris Stringer about, Homo sapiens and, that Neanderthals and so on, and Clive Finlayson's books and what have you. But nobody had really written about Denisovans. So I thought I'd write about Denisovans. So that's where it came from. So the book is about 50% of it is about Denisova, Denisova Cave, Denisovans. And then the rest of it is about this amazing assortment of other human types, groups, populations, species, call them what you will, that we have on the planet around 50 to 60,000 years ago. So we're talking about Neanderthals, obviously, Homo sapiens. We're talking about Denisovans. We're talking about hobbits and Homo luzonensis, these new human groups that have been found only in the last few years, less than 10 years. And the possibilities that there are others out there that maybe survived later, like Homo erectus, like Homo naledi, perhaps, who recently discovered in South Africa. Maybe they also survived up until more recent times. We just don't know yet. The point being that now it's just us. And so I wanted to write a book about the world before us. And so that's basically what it is.
Maybe if we got any slides that we can show if people don't know. I mean, we sit here and talk about species names and stuff, but we're never sure with an audience how much information people have. And I know there's people online at home as well. So it might just be worth also giving a very brief description of who we're talking about, these different species. Certainly for Neanderthals. Okay, so Tom has got a map here of fossil sites for Neanderthals. So it's not the entirety of every Neanderthal site because there's hundreds of them. So the Neanderthals as a distinctive human population species, they emerge around sort of between 400 and 350,000 years ago in Western Eurasia. And then they continue on through until about 40,000 years ago, when they disappear from the archaeological record, because we now know from genetics that they technically are sort of still here in all living people. There is a genetic legacy from Neanderthals, but they disappear as a distinctive anatomical population, and their archaeological record, or at least the record, the kinds of cultures that we had seen being made by them previously, they also disappear around 40,000. So that's kind of the context for who the Neanderthals are. But something else I think that, maybe not everybody, if you haven't read much or come across much human origins research before, is quite how close Neanderthals actually are to us in an evolutionary perspective. We have, as Tom said, many, many kinds of hominin species which go back 2, 3, 4 million years. And we also have stone artifacts now, 3.3 million years ago. The Neanderthals, when you look at that very deep time range, they're very close to us, much, much closer than the prehistorians who first discovered Neanderthals may have believed. So that's kind of where they fit in. And maybe if you talk a bit about Denisova and Naledi and everything.
Yeah. So if you imagine Neanderthals living, we think in probably the western part of Eurasia, I think that there's an emerging paradigm that Denisovans are their sort of eastern equivalents. So in terms of modern living humans, we find a lot of Denisovan DNA is actually found in the eastern part of Eurasia, and particularly in Melanesia, Aboriginal Australia, island Southeast Asia, and also in eastern parts of Eurasia, like in China and Japan, and the subcontinent, although it's smaller amounts of Denisovan DNA. So the archaeological evidence is suggesting that perhaps it's the east where Denisovans are. And Denisova Cave, when you look at the map of Eurasia, is about halfway across that continent. And so it's perhaps tempting to think of that region as perhaps as hybridization zone, where you have Neanderthals sometimes being there. We know that Neanderthals are there quite early, actually. More than 150,000 years ago, we have Neanderthal DNA and Neanderthal fossil remains, right up until perhaps as late as 60,000 at sites like Chagirskaya. And we have Denisovans there at the same time. There are now some intriguing new fossil evidence. New fossil evidence is coming through regarding Denisovans, fragmentary finds. We have, for example, at Baishia Cave on the Tibetan Plateau, we have Denisovan fossil remains. And we also have sediment DNA of Denisovans too. We have another couple of little finds that could be, but they haven't furnished any DNA yet. And we have this incredible new skull that was published last year called the Dragon Man, Homo longi, which some specialists, we've got a picture of it, I think a bit later, which some specialists have suggested could be a Denisovan. But there's, again, no DNA evidence in support of that. So the world of Denisovans is very fragmentary. In fact, the confident Denisovans you can fit on the palm of one hand. They're very fragmentary. There are only 5 or 6 actual pieces that we know about. So compared to Neanderthals, it's completely new information, really.
Yeah, I mean, like for Neanderthals, we have thousands of pieces of bone and teeth, and some of them relate to relatively complete skeletons. Others are just the odd piece from one site. So the record is really significantly different to Denisovans, but that's because we discovered Neanderthals a much longer time ago, 165 odd years ago.
But one thing we do have for Denisovans, that we do have for Neanderthals as well, but we have a very, very good high coverage genome data set of Denisovans. So we know that in terms of their population, they're very complex. In fact, it's suggested that there may be 3 different populations of Denisovans, great deal of genetic diversity. And evidence is coming forward that certain living humans have different ancestry from different Denisovan populations, which have a great deal of ancestral depth, back to 370, 380,000 years split times from, for example, Neanderthal population. So we have a great DNA record, but not such a great fossil record. So people have quipped that Denisovans are a genome in search of a fossil, which I think is quite funny.
Maybe we could show the skeleton pictures or something.
Yep.
Yeah, oh, there we are. Here we are. So, yeah, this is just sort of to give a brief introduction to the differences, but also the similarities in Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And it would be nice if we could have a similar image for Denisovans, but we don't yet. So we can't sort of know exactly what they look like across their entire skeleton. That's going to be really, you know, incredible to sort of wonder how long that might take us to find that out.
Well, if Dragon Man turns out to be Denisovan, then we do have a skull, which is exciting, but it's not confirmed yet. But geneticists have tried to predict what Denisovans might look like based on this complex chemical methylation that is a sort of epigenetics, or although this is very experimental yet and somewhat controversial, but people have made an effort to predict what Denisovans might look like based on some of this genomic data. But we don't have any skeletal remains yet. And that would be one of the most exciting things I think that one could find in terms of Denisovans.
Definitely.
We're waiting for that.
So in this image, at least, you can see that, you know, if you don't know much about Neanderthals, you know, it's quite easy still for people to retain an idea that Neanderthals are very similar to a gorilla or very hunched over or something like this. And, you know, it's really clear from this image that that's not the case. They are fully upright. They walked as upright as we do. They probably had a slightly different way of walking, just very slightly, because there are differences in sort of all across their body. There are differences, but we're looking at another kind of human, essentially. That's the foundational, I think, perspective for where we are now as archaeologists. And, you know, there are differences in terms of the proportions of some of the bones, the thickness, and especially you can see that the ribs on Neanderthals flare out a lot more. They are wider in their chest and their waist. And also, obviously, the skull is really quite different. In some ways, the size of their eyes and the opening for the nose is really dramatic. But also the front of their face, you can't quite see it there, but they sort of, the whole of their nose area and the mouth is just pulled forward slightly. There's more bone growth cells here, basically, so it grows a bit more. And the shape of the actual skull isn't sort of like a balloon, sort of like us. It's quite globular. Neanderthals is much more swept back. But overall, if you met a Neanderthal, you would think that that's a kind of a person. But yeah, your other impressions of them might be a little bit different. But
I mean, there have been some attempts at reconstructing, I mean, putting Neanderthal in a suit on a train, and would you recognize the difference?
That happened to me, actually.
Yeah.
I just been at the Neanderthal Museum in Germany, and I knew that they had a reconstruction sculpture wearing a suit, just leaning on the side of something. And I still didn't remember it. And I did a double take when I realized that was him, because I did just walk past and not even notice. But yeah, so this is kind of, I guess, the background. We were thinking for the rest, or for the middle part of the talk, that we can talk a little bit about how the books happened, and you've touched on that, and also what our experience was writing popular books as researchers in the areas, and I guess, yeah, come towards sort of thinking about what we really are interested about in the archaeology and the discipline as a whole, and then have some questions at the end. So yeah, do feel free to ask us questions. So do you want to maybe talk a bit more about your own career background?
Yeah. So as I said at the beginning, as an academic, writing a lot of scientific publications and running quite a large research lab on a semi-commercial basis, is very busy, very busy. And my dad, who's an archaeologist, said, oh yeah, you should definitely write a book, because he's an archaeologist that's written quite a few books. And he said, you really should. It's a great thing to do as an academic. And I was like, no, I can't. Anyway, as I said before, eventually I got the motivation to do it. So I thought, well, how do I do it? Because I had absolutely no idea. How do you go about writing a book? I had no clue. So I thought I'd ask a friend. So I asked my friend Henry G., who's a writer and an editor at Nature, and he'd written lots of books. So I said, Henry, can I just ask you a quick question? How do you go about doing this? He said, get an agent is the first thing to do. So I thought, okay, right. Can you recommend any? So the first person he recommended, I just contacted. And it happened to be this woman called Joanna Swainson, who works at Hardman Swainson. It's an agent in London. And so I contacted her and I said, I'm interested in writing a book. And she said, oh, great. Okay. So she came up to Oxford to talk to me. I had lunch, and she basically told me what to do, which is basically you have to write a proposal, a book proposal, in which you outline what your book is going to be about. You write a bit about yourself. You write what the chapters are going to be like, and give an example of the kind of writing that you're going to do. And then you give that to her, and then she takes it to the publishers and see whether anybody's interested. So I thought, piece of cake, can do that, no problem. She said, I'll give you a guide. Someone else who's written a science book's done some of this, and I'll send that to you with this permission. So she sent me this other author who'd already published a book, and oh my God, it was like 150 pages. It was like so detailed. I had to write 30,000 words, like 2 chapters. I thought, oh my God. So I didn't do anything for 4 years. And then eventually I thought, I've got to do this. So I had a bit of time. So I went back and I wrote this proposal. And then the really exciting thing happened, which was that different publishers wanted to publish the book. And so they kind of bidded against each other for the right to publish it, which was really exciting. So in the end, Penguin Books were the ones that wanted to publish it. So that was cool. Anyway, that's how the book writing actually started.
Yeah, it's funny because my experience is not the same at all. I mean, well, in the first place, Tom was much more senior in his academic career than I was at the point I wrote this. So I had a postdoc in Bordeaux for a couple of years. It was a Marie Curie fellowship. And after that, I was thinking about applying for different research grants and things. But, as anybody who has reached that career stage knows, that's not an easy situation right now to get postdoctoral funding. And so I wasn't really sure what to do. But I had already been approached by a publisher, not to write this book, but to write another book, which was going to be about prehistory. It was going to be about birds and humans in prehistory, because I happen to just really enjoy bird watching, and the publisher sort of came across my public outreach work on Twitter. Basically, I do a lot of talking about archaeological things, and so that was how that connection was made. So I didn't have an agent. I was direct straight to the publisher. So what happened was basically I finished my postdoc, and we weren't quite sure about publishing the one about birds, although maybe that'll happen at some point. But we had already discussed maybe we'll write a book about Neanderthals. But the idea of doing that was really intimidating, because it's such a big topic and it's so close to my own research that it was a little bit frightening. But I decided to do it and start writing. And so that was the contract that got signed. And so I started writing that in early 2017, and I finished it in early 2020. So it took 3 years to write it.
So with me, it was a bit quicker, because I signed this damn contract and they said, we want you to deliver the book by May 2021 or something. And I was like, yeah, it sounds fine. Yeah, it was ages away. And then as the clock started ticking, I was like, oh my God. And, but my book is written in the first person. So it's more like the beginning part of it is all very kind of, I did this and I'm interested in that, and my experiences firsthand. And so what I found was that the first half of the book I wrote really quickly, and it was about Denisova and Denisovans and so on. But when you're writing about 4 little pieces of bone and not much else, you kind of rapidly run out of things to say. So I got halfway through and then, okay, right, I had a bit of a dead end. But luckily I had really good editors and advisors and friends who helped me to sort of think about other things and widen it a bit, which was great. And then, of course, the COVID came. And for me, writing the entire draft of it was not easy, but it was certainly more doable. But the thing I found more difficult was the editing of it. And that took a long time to pick and choose what you wanted to write about and reorder things. I found that chapters weren't really making sense and I had to switch them. And so that was something that took ages, and rewriting and rereading drafts, and it just seemed to take ages. And in a sense, that's a good sign, because you know that when you're sick of seeing something, it's probably close to being finished. And that's the way I feel with scientific papers anyway. When you see them again and again, you go, that's it. It's a good sign. When you're sick of it, it's pretty much done.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday there was another talk. I'm not quite sure how many people here came to this other talk where it was a whole sort of presentation talking about the differences in scientific writing compared to sort of specifically popular science writing about Neanderthals. But it is funny that there are some congruences and similarities with how one feels and the confidence that you feel or not about what you've actually written, and when it's time to let it go. But it's like with this book, it was always just going to be about Neanderthals, so it was a bit more obvious what my coverage was going to be. But sometimes people don't believe me when I say it was really difficult to choose what to keep, because there's actually so much about Neanderthals that you could write, so many sites. And the manuscript for this was 250,000 words at one point. It got down to about 120 or 130. So, the richness of the archaeology was a blessing, and also a problem in terms of having to learn how to not write as you would write a scientific paper, where you put every single case and example of the thing that you're discussing in. You can't really do that in a book like this. So you have to be selective. And in a way, it was actually nice to realize that I could just write the kind of book about the things that I thought were most interesting. And I didn't have to cover everything about Neanderthals, because all of the things that I find really interesting were going to be diverse enough and that would actually give examples of all these aspects of their lives without having to mention every single site. So it was really quite freeing to sort of just think, well, I'm just going to choose what I like.
And then in terms of your experience of writing, was it something that you really enjoyed, or did you find it a bit of a drag sometimes? What was the...
Yeah, sometimes it was really, really difficult, but I think that's the case with anything that you do that's intensive work, really, and that involves a lot of synthesis of data, whether it's sort of archaeological data or literary data or anything. And just, as you said, like wrestling with the structure of books. I considered writing this from a chronological perspective, but I decided I didn't want to do that because lots of other people have done that before. But also I wanted to actually try to make links through time and across space between the different aspects of Neanderthal life. So really to underline the diversity in what we know about Neanderthals, and the fact that there wasn't just one way of being a Neanderthal, and a Neanderthal from where I live in Wales had a really different experience than one that lived, say, in Palestine at completely different points in time. So it was nice to actually not be restrained by the chronological structure.
And the way that I think that really comes across well in your book is we have this tendency to think Neanderthals, cold adapted species living in Ice Age Europe. And yet, when you see the record of climate and the way the climate's changed, that clearly isn't the case, right?
Yeah, that's something that I guess I wanted to communicate that Neanderthals knew all sorts of landscapes and climates and different geographies. And so there's so much more to Neanderthals than the popular image of them sort of often is really quite restrictive. But I also, I guess, just from a personal perspective, I wanted to really try to share the way that archaeology is like a multidisciplinary discipline. And a lot of what we do actually is about world building in how we look at the Neanderthals. We don't just say, okay, what's going on in this site? We try to stretch outward from whatever analysis we're doing and look at a landscape scale, talk about the overall climate, look at the pollen in your site. And that might be telling you about an enormous landscape all around that. So archaeology now is very much about sort of recreating the contextual world. But all of that, when you read the scientific papers and the articles, if you're not a specialist, that's very inaccessible, but it's so evocative. And so I wanted to basically use the fact that I could translate all of this information that is in the scientific literature and translate it into something that was accessible to people who had never read any scientific information, maybe knew nothing about Neanderthals, nothing about all the Ice Age climates, warm or cold, and sort of help them imagine themselves in that past.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's absolutely true. I think for me, I really enjoyed reading many, many papers, often for the first time. And I think one of the things that at the moment, there's so much information and so much new data and so many publications that come out regarding this. It is a real challenge to actually distill things down to general readership. And one of the things that recently has happened is that you get these very short articles written in the big journals like Nature and Science, and you get these huge supplementary documents that go with the paper. And sometimes the information in those supplementaries is actually more interesting in a way than the information that's in the main papers. And certainly you get lots of hints and lots of examples of stuff in there. So for example, with this Denisova cave, we published these two articles in 2018 and about the dating of the site and the climate change from Denisova and so on. And I learned so much from the supplementary from one of the other papers, all about how they reconstruct how the climate was at that particular time at Denisova cave. And they did it by looking at different animal populations and trapping animals and looking at observations of animals in the modern world and where they lived, and then inferring from that the types of environments that those animals lived in the past, and then looking at the archaeological faunal record and inferring what the climate must have been like based on that, as well as pollen, as well as isotope geochemistry, and as well as these amazing records of oxygen isotopes from places like Greenland and Antarctica, where we can actually see the global climate change. And so bringing all of this together, you're able to then, as you say, infer what the climate was likely to be at some of these really important sites. So huge amounts of information, but distilling that information down was, a challenge, but also exciting at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice. I did actually get to read Tom's book before it came out, so I could give him a quote. But I do genuinely think they're actually very complementary, because mine is so sort of focused on Neanderthals, but also the archaeology. But in a sense, I didn't want to lose any words about the Neanderthals themselves by exploring the methodology and how we do archaeology now. I kind of, give hints about how it works, but I don't really explain radiocarbon or whatever. And Tom's book is so brilliant because it gives you that absolutely solid grounding in exactly what do we do now? How does it work? And as you said, the other thing that your book does, which mine doesn't, is that it's got the personal perspective. And yeah, I just want to know, like, how did you find writing it from that personal perspective?
Yeah, I thought it was really fun, actually. I found it easy. But I wanted to bring in also that, I'm really interested, like you said yesterday, with this all the stories of how these fossils came to be found. And what's really exciting is that some of them were just found by luck and by chance by members of the public. I mean, the Penghu one, which is this jawbone that was fished out of the sea off Taiwan, is a classic example. You know, this guy living in Taiwan, just an ordinary guy, he's walking through town and he goes into this antique shop and he sees this, you know, lots of things and bits of furniture, and then he sees this funny little bone, this jawbone like thing, and he goes to the man who owns the shop. So what's this? He said, oh yeah, this is a bone, old bone, and it came from a fisherman. He brought it to me, and it turned out that this guy had been fishing. This fisherman had been fishing in this deep water channel between China and Taiwan, and he'd fished up this bone, lots of things, and he. So that's interesting. And he'd taken it to the antique shop, and the antique shop owner had bought it, and this guy had bought it off him. And this man was very interested in it. So he took it home and cleaned it up. And he thought, man, I'd like to know more about this. And so he took it to the museum, and the museum researchers realized this is something quite important. And it turns out that it's almost certainly a Denisovan that was fished up. So these little stories in the background of all these fossil discoveries, and there are many of them, I just found really fascinating. So I just wanted to, you know, share those kind of stories about people.
Absolutely. It's in a way like you're talking about the supplementary data and then the appendices to big scientific papers. There is always so much about the history of the finds in those, and it's very difficult not to fall down
rabbit holes,
following old strange stories of how fossils we keep dropping these, how fossils actually were found. And I found that a useful thing actually to do for the book, although it's just interesting and fascinating. But it also allowed me to focus on a couple or two or three key sites and keep coming back to them, sites which do have very strange, unusual histories of discovery, convoluted stories about research, because it then allows you to talk about how the archaeological picture of Neanderthals has changed over decades and decades as one site has been reinvestigated and revisited, and the things that we can do. One example of that, which is really, really fascinating from recent work, is a site, La Chapelle-aux-Cents in France. It's one of the earliest sort of mostly complete Neanderthal skeletons that were excavated between 1908 to 1909. And at that early point, people kind of actually did assume that it probably was a burial, but the level of excavation in those early days, you know, more than a century ago, was a long way from what we would consider acceptable now. However, in some cases, like at this site, archaeologists today can go back and try to not only look at the collections in museums from a long time ago, but actually go back to that site, see if there's any remaining sediment there, and try and reassess, you know, what was the actual situation? What were the sediments like? Can we say if there really was a burial? And at La Chapelle-aux-Cents, they've done a brilliant job. It was not very easy for them really to be sure if there was a burial pit or not, but they certainly were able to show that the condition of the bones of this individual male Neanderthal skeleton were not in the same condition as the animal bones in the layer around it, or other pieces, fragments of other Neanderthals that they also rediscovered in these layers. They also were not in the same condition as this skeleton by itself. So something is going on with that site, but you know, it's only modern understanding and modern approaches that have allowed us to return and find this out. So.
Yeah, I think that's the thing I try and bring forward in my book, is all about, you know, the tremendous ability now we have to do this incredible science. And I think the sediment DNA is one of the most exciting things in the last few years. The ability to take samples of basically dirt, sediment, and to extract potentially human DNA from that is just one of the most exciting things, I think. And over the next few years, we're going to see some big breakthroughs in further understanding, you know, the distribution of Neanderthals, where they lived, because we think they're probably more widely distributed than they were, perhaps. Certainly Denisovans and their distribution, just on the basis of DNA and sediment. And I remember talking to Matthias Meyer, who's one of the guru of ancient sediment DNA work, really at the Max Planck in Leipzig. And he told me if we didn't find any Denisovan bones, we would know Denisovans existed just on the sediment DNA that we've recovered from Denisova Cave, which is really amazing to think about.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, like trying to predict what's going to happen in archaeology is, difficult to do. There are some things that we can say will happen. Obviously, we're going to have a lot more ancient DNA from bones and also from sediments as well. Now that it's able to be done really quite fast, that's work that's just huge amounts ahead. And it will be interesting not only to see whether the range of Neanderthals does go much further, and we're talking about East Asia rather than just Western Eurasia, but also the other, are Denisovans, is Denisova Cave really the westernmost boundary for that population? And could it be that there were occasional movements of Denisovans further west, and perhaps we might only find those in sediment samples? But this is the reason why, as archaeologists, you have to keep everything. Even your sediment samples can be useful.
And this is one of the other things about writing a book, is that you're terrified that you're going to be out of date very soon. And particularly with something as fast moving as this field, you kind of think when the book comes out, oh God, please don't let there be some massive discovery or something that just throws all this down the pan and all that work I've done. And so I spent the first sort of 6 months thinking, please, please, please. But on the one hand, I was really excited. Maybe it'd be cool if someone did find a Denisovan skeleton, but on the other hand, I was thinking, not quite yet, please, just wait a bit.
Yeah,
do you ever feel like that, being trumped a bit?
Yeah, I was still like putting in new finds. When I was supposed to be editing the book down and making it shorter, things would come out and I'm like, oh no, I need to put another sentence in. So, it's difficult, but I mean, that's why it's such an exciting field. And it's a cliche, I think, that when you see popular coverage by the media or newspapers or on TV, often people will say, oh, this one find has completely changed everything. Most of the time, that's not really true, but sometimes it is. So when those things come along, it's impossible not to feel that buzz in the research community. Everybody does feel like that.
We've got a list of things here. We're coming towards the end and we'll get some questions, but should we say what the favorite aspect of the books is? What's your favorite aspect of your book? What's the bit you like the best?
I think two things. I really did enjoy, after I got over my fear, I enjoyed writing the beginnings of every chapter. I have a sort of a short, more like a narrative, literary imagination sort of perspective about Neanderthals. And I really loved writing those, because even more than just writing the text, it feels like something is kind of like flowing and you kind of just open yourself up and it comes out. So I enjoyed that. And the other thing I liked was actually what a privilege it was to be able to look at the entirety of the Neanderthal record and just spend so much time thinking about it, and also think about how there are connections between different aspects of their lives, and really sort of make those links when you write a book like this. I love doing that.
Yeah, I think for me, it was probably just talking about and writing about Denisovans popular for the first time, because my Russian friends, and particularly now with this dreadful situation we find ourselves in, they've done a huge amount of work over decades. And so to be able to share that when they were so encouraging, yes, we really want you to write this, it'll be great. But also, I think one of the favorite things for me would be the Denny, writing about finding Denny. I think we've got a picture of this somewhere. Yeah, here it is. So very quickly, so we found this bone, our research team, and particularly my student Samantha Brown, who was a master student, and we were looking at Denisova Cave for human bones, because the human material is very, very small and broken up, and much of the bone at Denisova is broken up into tiny fragments by being chewed up by hyenas and other animals predominantly. So about 95% of the bones we find at the cave, we just have no idea what animal they are, or even if they're human. So using this amazing new technique called zooms, which is a way of looking at collagen peptides and the fingerprints that are specific to a species or a genus. So Sam and our group, we searched through thousands of bones, and we found this tiny bone, which is about 2.5 centimeters high, that turned out to be initially on the mitochondrial DNA, a Neanderthal bone, and you could never tell it's a human bone just by looking at it. It's completely undiagnostic. But what was incredible was that later, when our colleagues in Leipzig extracted nuclear DNA from it, they showed that it was a genetic hybrid. So its mother was a Denisovan, its mother was a Neanderthal, and the girl, it's a girl, her father was a Denisovan. So it was an F1 hybrid. And just sharing that with a general audience was great too. So I think that would be my favorite thing. I
like reading that bit because you really do convey some, the excitement. And when you're working in science, you have to be objective and all of this. But of course, there's emotion behind that, and it's impossible not to not to feel it.
Yeah, that was great. It was great from that. So I think that would be my favorite. Okay.
Yeah, we have some time. We've got some 12 minutes or so for questions.
Yeah. Does anyone want to add something or ask anything or have a chat?
Yeah.
Now's your chance. Otherwise, we can just keep going. Anybody want to ask anything?
Any random question about human origins?
Sorry? Oh yeah, if there is one. Yes.
Okay.
Give that to Martin. Give it to Martin a bit.
Hi. About 2 pictures ago, you showed the modern man and the Neanderthal. Actually, you showed 2 Neanderthals.
Yeah.
And the signature of the Neanderthals seems to be a female. So is it by chance you made the female the warrior?
Would you like to talk about this? Because this is, just the picture on the left there. Just a popular public. Yeah.
So if I understood the question, are you asking, is that skeleton, is the generic skeleton a female?
No.
Sorry.
The picture, the piece of vision that you showed on the left side.
Oh, this one. Oh, right. Sorry, I thought you meant the skeleton. Yep. So in terms of the public perception of females, is that what you mean? Sorry.
So the person on the left, to me, looks like the warrior.
Yeah.
Okay. The person behind looks like a male. So I implicitly thought this would be a female on the left.
Yeah, that is a female. I mean, that's a reconstruction, a sculpture. Yeah.
Did you make on purpose the female the warrior?
I wasn't involved in that.
I just used it as it's one of many reconstructions of Neanderthals that have come out.
That one's by the Kenneth. Yeah, that's by Alphonse and Adri Kennis. They're really incredibly well-respected reconstruction artists. And I don't know the story behind that exact choice, but I think it's fair to say that there's no reason to believe that no female Neanderthals ever hunted. There is a lot of ethnographic data that suggests that on average, men will hunt bigger game, but women will hunt sometimes, and depending on the climate, the species of animals available, and also the availability of childcare within their group, that can affect the likelihood. And because Neanderthals lived in so many different climates, I would expect in some places and in some times, females would be more likely to be hunting versus others.
Hi, thanks for the interesting introduction to your books. I'm an anthropologist, and I had a conversation with this guy already. We are working together in the department, and it might be related to language. I heard in all your talk here just the word archaeology. The word anthropology doesn't exist here. So I would be curious what your understanding is. Probably a language thing with England, but here in continental Europe, we understand anthropology as the science that deals with exactly that, with the skeletons, with the biology. And archaeology are those guys who deal with the artifacts, right? Tools and stuff. So when you only talk about archaeology. What is your understanding? What is archaeology and what is anthropology?
Well, I think pretty much the same as you. I wouldn't call myself an anthropologist. For me, anthropology is like the study of living people. Paleoanthropology would be the study of Neanderthals. So I wouldn't say I'm a paleoanthropologist, because in my head, from the research tradition that I was trained in, I'm not a bone specialist. I'm a stone tool specialist, so I would say I'm an archaeologist. But I do talk about the work of paleoanthropologists in the book, because I have 2 chapters about Neanderthal bodies and how they developed, and bioarchaeology. You know, what can we say about how Neanderthals lived by looking at the traces on their bodies? So I do talk about that, but from my perspective, I also wanted to talk about the things which I think get overlooked a little bit in many popular accounts of human evolution. There is actually a huge focus on the skeletons and not always so much about things like the micro layers in hearths and things like this. It's very difficult to discuss that. So that was why I talk about archaeology a lot when I'm talking right now, but there is anthropology in the book as well.
Yeah, because it's a good point, because of course we can excavate and we can do archaeology, but we have to infer and try and understand human behavior, and anthropology, of course, is that very discipline. So I think we're, in the modern era, we have to incorporate a range of different disciplines, and I think that's part of the challenge, but also part of the excitement. You can't do anything alone. You have to work with other disciplines and other people, and that's one of the great challenges I think that we encounter now, is understanding the language of the other disciplines and how that works. And it's really difficult for me. Getting to grips with some of the ancient DNA work was really challenging, and I had to rely on a lot of friends and colleagues to help me out and help me understand what 5' and 3' means, and all about different parts of the molecule and degradation and contamination issues and all that kind of stuff. And luckily I got some friends that helped me out with that. But I think it's really, we have to be flexible and understand each other's disciplines. And here in Austria, Gerhard is absolutely right. Physical anthropology is really a key in understanding human evolution. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'm a cognitive scientist, but I'm at the moment interested in the species concept that you use to separate the 2 species. At least in the main literature, you always find Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, and so on. But we know that they have very frequently hybrids and also Danny. I think I remember well from your book, that the father was Denisovan, but the grandfather was a Neanderthal again.
There was a Neanderthal further back than that.
Yeah, so
in the history, yes, that's right.
I think in the many thousand years, there were maybe many thousands of sexual interactions between the 2, and also the offspring were, of course, having another offspring. So maybe we have found too many of the maybe extreme forms of the distribution and not so many of these mixtures. But what is the justification to say these are 2 species and not 1? Allotaxis concept and so on.
I think an honest answer is that it is about history of science and heuristics. So if you only have Neanderthal skeletons to look at, they are obviously different, and no Homo sapiens populations ever sort of as a whole looked like Neanderthals. We didn't assimilate to the extent that we as a population looked like them, or the other way around. So there definitely was contact and interbreeding, but it was never on a scale that was large enough to alter them at a meta population level. But it is an interesting question. Would we be talking in terms of the differences about Neanderthals and all of the ways that we've framed thinking about their cognition, especially if we had known from the beginning how close they actually were to us, and that there had been interbreeding. But I think the problem is because we've had only skulls and skeletons for so long, that we do talk about different species. But it's a challenge for us going forward, you know, as we find more hybrids, more evidence. Are the Neanderthals 45,000 years ago, are they the same Neanderthals as they were 300,000 years ago after there is this input into them genetically? It's a question for the discipline to actually sort of consider, I think.
Yeah, I think in terms of the genetics, you see that virtually every single genome now that's coming out has evidence in the genome for some degree of admixture. And so we shouldn't really be surprised at this, because we see it in animals as well, just depending on how distinct they are in terms of evolutionary time. So more recent, rather like Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, you know, they clearly could interbreed. Whether or not they could do it each time successfully is still a matter of discussion and debate. But the mere fact that we have Neanderthal DNA suggests that interbreeding was the thing that could happen. And so, as I say, it's as Becky said, it's a legacy of Linnaean classification and history that we look to classify things as a species separate, but the mere definition is completely turned over by the fact that we can see these admixture events. So we need to sort of think in terms of how we, I don't know, do we classify them, or do we just see them as fluid boundaries between different species? But I think, Becky, you're absolutely right that, you know, that this is something that didn't happen uniformly. Otherwise, the DNA, the genomes would be similar, much more similar, and not separate as we can detect them in terms of genomic differences and physical appearance in terms of the phenotypes that we see. So when these groups got together, they did interbreed, but they weren't one meta population. That seems fairly certain.
Sorry.
Hello. So I have a kind of follow-up question to that one. Can we consider, so I'm not completely updated probably on the current debate, but the question is, can we consider the Denisovans to be a separate species or a regional variant, or which is the evidence actually that allows us to think of them as one way or the other?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And as you know, from the physical side of things, we don't really have anywhere near the same evidence as we do for Neanderthals in terms of what they physically look like. We do have the genomic information, genome. So if you think about the distance from living people back to our common chimp ancestor 6+ million years ago, and you imagine the difference between Neanderthals and Denisovans in terms of their autosomal DNA, their nuclear DNA, there's about an 11.7 and a 12.5% distance back to the common ancestor, the chimp common ancestor, that they are separated from in terms of our split times. And so that's quite similar. So they're quite closely related to each other in terms of that. But then again, we are as well. I think that as we go on, we're going to find that I think that there is more population complexity in terms of Denisovans. We see this based on the genomic evidence. I think it's becoming clear that there's more than one, definitely more than one population of Denisovans, probably two, at least perhaps three. But more evidence is coming out because the places where we think Denisovans lived, the DNA is not preserved very well in ancient specimens. So a lot of work's been done on modern living people to extract and analyze the integress DNA in those people. And that evidence tells us that there is more complexity in terms of Denisovan populations. And I think that we might well find, for example, that Denisovan populations lived east of Wallace's line. There was a population probably there in island Southeast Asia and probably in Eastern Eurasia, and perhaps another one too on another island. People have suggested perhaps the Philippines might have been a place where there was another center of another Denisovan population. So yeah, I hope that shed some light on the question, but there's still a lot going on, a lot of work to do, and a lot that we don't understand yet. So, but I think there's enough evidence to suggest they're separate groups.
Okay, thank you.
Another question? Any other questions?
Oh, we're signing.
Okay. Okay, well.
Any question online?
Just one final thing that I think we wanted to briefly talk about was this, I mentioned it before, was this incredible discovery in the 1930s of dragon man, this Homo longi it's been classified as, by Chinese colleagues. There are 3 papers that were published, Chiang Li et al. In 2021 is where this photograph came from. And this incredible, very complete cranium was found by a worker in China in the 1930s and buried under Japanese occupation in a well, and then later fished out when he told on his deathbed some of his family that he'd buried a very important human relic down.
Another one of these strange stories.
Yeah, so quite a cool story, and it came to the scientific world of science that way. There was no DNA that came from Dragon Man. Some people have suggested, based upon the age, it's more than 160,000 years ago, and some similarities with some Denisovan remains that we know about now from the Tibetan Plateau, that this could well be the skull of a Denisovan. But at the moment, it's still under debate, and it's been classified as a new species, although Chris Stringer feels that it should be probably called Homo daliensis by virtue of the fact that it's more similar to a previous skull, a Dali specimen that was found and classified a lot earlier than that. So again, you can see how the world of paleoanthropology is moving quite quickly, and things can change very fast.
Yeah.
Anyway. We think it's time probably to wrap up and say thank you very much for coming, and thanks for all your questions. And we hope that perhaps if you wanted to grab a copy of these books and read them, that would be good. The main point to have this conversation is that Becky is here on her tour, and that her book has just been published in German. Do you want to give the title of it?
If I can pronounce it, Der Verkannte Mensch. There it is.
Der Verkannte Mensch, there it is.
Yeah, and a wonderful honor to have the reconstruction of a Neanderthal girl there on the cover. That's the Kennis brothers again. Yeah, fantastic.
So,
you.
Go and grab yourself a copy of that one, and enjoy the book. And
thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you everyone online who came to register for this talk. Thank you very much.
Bye.